Now, another area that you've written a lot about is the return of socialism and Marxism. And I've always wondered, and are still wondering, is that have people simply forgotten the horrors that socialist regimes brought in the 20th century, or are they just making excuses for that? For example, the old thing that real communism has never been tried. The reason that it failed is because of evil capitalists plotting against it. Where do you
Right.
fit on that?
I think there's a generational shift there. I don't think that most young people have forgotten the lessons of history. I think they just never have learned the lessons of history. One of the things that comes out of much of what we call pragmatic philosophically education and postmodern education is that the world is changing so much and circumstances are always evolving and revolving so fast that really history doesn't teach us any lessons, that every generation or every year or every moment is different. There's no causality and universality across time. So from their perspective, what's the point really of teaching 50 years ago or 100 years ago? It's all pointless. So history education has been eviscerated in the last generation. And I think all the studies that I have seen about what students know about the history of socialism or the history of capitalism or the history of anything is it's relatively abysmal. And of course, part of the problem is that history has, to a significant extent, also been politicized. So you get politicized versions of history and politicized history teachers and history professors who are now the older generation often undersell or understate or ignore entirely the abysmal track record of the various kinds of socialism that have been tried. I think for older people, though, I hold older people up to a higher standard,
Mm.
particularly professional educators and professional university educators. If you are going to hold yourself out as an expert on some subject matter, to the extent that you say, yes, I'm going to take every year a new class of your children, and I'm going to take lots of your money, either through tuition dollars directly paid or through government subsidies, and I'm going to teach them important stuff, then you really should be holding yourself to a high bar of professionalism. And so this then I think speaks to what you're saying toward the end. I don't think there are any honest people who can say among educators and professors that real socialism has not been tried. That is a bad faith kind of denialism. You want to say, okay, pure communism has not been tried or pure socialism has not been tried. It's always very transparent that when you probe that person a step or two, that what they mean is they have their particular idea about the thousand things that they would do if they were the absolute dictator of a socialist economy. And then they say, well, here's some socialist experiment that did one or two things differently, therefore I can ignore entirely the experiment. And that's clearly a bad faith move. I think also if you're going to compare apples and oranges and you want to say, well, I don't think perfect socialism has been tried, then the apples to apples comparison or apples to oranges comparison you want to make is say, well, then pure free market capitalism also has not been tried. So what you then want to do is to say, well, there's been a lot of pretty close to socialism experiments that have been done, and a lot of then pretty close to free market capitalism experiments that have been done. And those are the things that you're going to compare. And if you, again, are going to be a professional, you look at the data, and pretty close to capitalism, excuse my bluntness, kicks the ass of pretty close to socialism every single time. There's just no comparison. And if you are not front and center on that data, then I think you are being dishonest. So I think the mark of an honest socialist, and there are some of them that I know, and they will say things like, yes, socialism was tried, a dozen major experiments in the 20th century, a few dozen minor or smaller scale experiments in the 20th century. Yes, they all failed. That's an honest socialist. But what I am trying to do is say, this is why I think they failed, and to come up with better ideas so that when we try socialism again, and I might be a true believer in socialism still, we are not going to make those mistakes again.
Well, that's the argument that I use as well, that pure capitalism hasn't been tried, but almost capitalism has been a success where it's been implemented, while
Yes.
almost socialism has had 100% failure rate.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah. But I think the more important thing here is that most socialists, I have never, ever met a socialist, and I've been talking to socialists for 35 plus years since I started university. And often I will ask them, so why are you a socialist? And they never say, well, it's because, I studied economics a lot. And, the case for central planning just is overwhelmingly strong in my view. Or I have studied political governance, and I believe that concentrating power into the hands of a small elite is always going to work. So it's never through a serious study of political science or a serious study of economics or a serious study of history. It's always that they believe that socialism is moral. They have moral objections to capitalism. They understand a certain picture of socialism that sounds ideal to them, and they are so attracted to that portrayal on moral grounds that they become converts, they become committed, and then it's always after the fact that they start considering economic issues. What do I do about the historical track record? What do I do about these political governance issues, and so on? We are up against people who are committed to very different understandings about what fairness means, what equality means, what justice means, what freedom means, compared to those of us who are on the more free market capitalist, democratic Republican side of the street.
I find that young Marxists, they haven't actually read Marx because they're constantly tripped up on what Marx meant in a lot of his writings, and they also don't try to understand their opponents' philosophies. They're always raging about racism and fascism and Nazism, but they don't want to explore it, understand how such ideas became popular, because in their mind there's nothing ever convincing about why these ideas became popular. And of course that's the reason why they don't want other people to be exposed in case they are convinced. It's a double contradiction, because either they're evil, yeah, and nobody should ever be convinced, or you're scared that they will be convinced.
Yes, that's right. So those of us who advocate genuine liberal education, our argument is that you're training young minds to be able to think for themselves, to make judgments about complicated matters, and to be able to make judgments about problems that don't necessarily have a solution yet. There's not yet an answer in the book. And so what that means is you give people hard problems, you expose them to different ways of looking at the problem, and you ask them to compare and contrast competing solutions. And you don't use any professorial authoritarian methods to say to the students that you have to believe what I believe, because you genuinely want liberal-minded students in the best sense of what liberal-minded should be. So the young Marxists that you are talking about, there's an analogy here to a certain kind of small r religious psychology, that we do know that people can become committed to a belief system, and it can be a religious one, it can be a political one, it can be in any number of fields, that they have committed to it without having done the serious thinking, right? It was maybe the first belief system that they were exposed to. It was presented nicely in idealistic form, and they really wanted to believe something, and they made a leap of faith commitment. And that sort of person then does become a kind of evangelist, and they won't know the history of their own tradition. They won't know the empirical studies. They won't be interested in having to give equal time or give a serious hearing to other viewpoints that are out there. So that is a psychological problem that those individuals have, and it's a history of political thinking, just as it's very common in the history of religious thinking as well.
Now, you've written about the modern green movement and how they appear to be part of the anti-capitalist school of thought. And there's an expression we have in Australia for our greens, which is their watermelons, green on the
Sure.
outside, red on the inside. But there's also
Yeah.
the complicating thing that a lot of people who advocate green ideas are actually people who've got really rich off capitalism.
Sure. Yes. Well, I think a healthy environmental philosophy, if you think what that is, I think if you're just a normal human being, you want to live in a world that is clean, that has important health effects. You want to be healthy. You want the people you care about to be healthy. So anyone interested in environmental values is going to be concerned with waste disposal issues. It doesn't. It's not rocket science that you should wash your hands, that you should wash your clothes, keep your house clean, your neighborhood clean, and you just scale that out. We're also interested in economic long-term productivity. So we know that production requires resources, so we're concerned with what is the stock of resources and what's the rate at which we are using them compared to being innovative and discovering new resources and so forth. So environmental concern for the status of the resources that are available to us, that's just normal. Now, I think that the case is strong for saying that a liberal, scientific, market-friendly economy, and more broadly, Enlightenment society is going to be the most environment-friendly system that you can possibly have. And largely that's because then you're going to have, when problems arise, the kind of people who have the scientific training to think about those problems, to generate the knowledge, the engineering skills to come up with new solutions, and the entrepreneurial ability to experiment and be flexible enough to deal with the thing. So the important thing on environmental values is, where does the scientific, technological, and entrepreneurial flexibility come from? And that is not at all coming from the left-wing side of the spectrum. Marxism has been very clunky. The various back-to-earth people are opposed to science, they're opposed to technology, they're typically opposed to entrepreneurism, so they are undercutting. I would say also, if you're interested in having a clean, healthy, sustainable environment, that takes typically a lot of wealth. Building modern sewage treatment plants, that takes a lot of millions of dollars. And so you need to have a wealthy society so that you can keep things clean. Now, the empirical data are clear. I mean, obviously, you go to the prosperous parts of a country, and they are the cleanest and the most economically sustainable. It's always the poorest places that are the dirtiest and the unhealthiest. And the same thing holds for nations. I would also invite people who are interested in environmental values to look at, and there's good data at this, you can just Google this, where are the dirtiest places in the world, right? The most toxic garbage dumps, the dirtiest rivers, the most polluted air, and so on. And what you find is that it's always in the least free market, capitalist advanced nations. The free market capitalist nations have minor problems in those areas, but it's always places where there's a huge measure of government control. A lot of them are former socialist and communist experiments that just were disasters for the environment. So once again, the historical track record is solidly on behalf of what I think of as good environmental thinking, and that would be encouraging liberalism, encouraging entrepreneurialism, encouraging the advance of science and technology.